Elias pressed his blood-slicked palm against the iridescent curve of Vora's throat, feeling the frantic, dying stutter of her secondary heart. Above them, the translucent dome of Aetherius was no longer a window to the stars, but a jagged mouth of falling glass and vacuum hell. The Xylos guards, the supposedly unbreakable sovereignty, had vanished into the smoke of the Void Reaver's strike, leaving their empress to bleed out on a floor of crushed crystal. Elias ignored the proximity alarm screaming in his ear. He ignored the way his own breath came in ragged, freezing gasps. He only saw the dulling sheen of her scales and the way her golden eyes began to roll back. He reached for the forbidden injector in his kit, the one designed for neural bridging, and drove it home. It turned out that the summit was a death trap from the start. Hours earlier, the air on Aetherius had been thick with the scent of synthetic lilies and the stifling weight of ancient protocol. Elias had spent the morning obsessively checking his medkit, a habit born from years of serving on frontier stations where a misplaced scalpel meant a funeral. He was just a medic, a human face in a sea of towering, chitinous nobility. The Xylos sovereignty didn't look at humans. They looked through them, seeing nothing but a short-lived species with a curious obsession for fixing things that were already broken. He had watched Empress Vora from a distance during the opening ceremonies. She was a vision of terrifying grace, her scales shimmering with a bioluminescence that shifted from deep violet to a defiant crimson. She didn't speak to the human delegation. She barely acknowledged the peace treaties laid out on the obsidian tables. There was a coldness there, a distance that felt like light years. Then the sky broke. The Void Reaver's ships dropped from the clouds like predatory birds, their heavy cannons liquefying the marble pillars of the Great Hall in seconds. In the chaos, the vacuum seal of the dome sputtered. Screams were cut short by the sudden, violent roar of escaping atmosphere. Elias had been knocked flat, his vision swimming in shades of gray, but as he scrambled for his fallen kit, he saw her. Vora was pinned under a collapsed support beam, a jagged shard of carbon steel buried deep in the nexus of her chest plates. Her guards, panicked by the sudden failure of their neural links, had retreated to the bunkers, abandoning the eternal empress to the cold. Elias didn't think about the treaties. He didn't think about the fact that a human touching a Xylos monarch was a crime punishable by flaying. He just ran, but the wound was catastrophic. Her biology was rejecting the trauma, her nervous system shutting down in a defensive spiral that would end in total cellular collapse. Standard cauterization wouldn't work. Her blood, a thick, silver mercury-like fluid, was pouring onto the white stone. "I'd rather die trying to save someone than live knowing I ran away," Elias muttered to himself, his fingers trembling as he dialed the injector to its maximum setting. The device was a prototype, a neural bond shunt. It was designed to bridge two nervous systems to allow a medic to manually regulate a patient's autonomic functions. For the Xylos, however, this wasn't just medicine. It was a sacred biological fusion. To knit his DNA into hers, even for a moment, was to cross a line that had never been breached in 3 centuries of contact. He felt the needle sink past her scales. The world blurred. Suddenly, he wasn't just feeling the cold of the moon. He was feeling her pain, a white-hot spike in his own chest. He felt her memories flickers of ancient suns, and the crushing loneliness of a throne crashing into his mind. The connection snapped into place with the violence of a solar flare. Elias gasped, his spine arching as her physiology flooded his senses. It wasn't just data. It was the crushing weight of her sovereignty, the cold responsibility of 1,000 cycles, and the sharp, jagged terror of a dying god. He forced his heart to slow, dragging her pulse down with his own. He became her anchor, a biological counterweight to the shock tearing her apart. Around them, the Reavers were landing, their heavy boots thudding against the crystal floor. But as Elias worked, his hands moving with a precision that defied the tremors in his limbs, a strange silence fell over the Xylos guards who had begun to creep back from the shadows. They didn't fire. They didn't move. They stared in a paralyzed, holy horror at the human kneeling in the blood of their empress, his skin glowing with the same violet hue as her own. by the laws of my people, that makes you my husband, Vora whispered. Her voice was a rasping ghost of sound, vibrating not in his ears but directly against the base of his skull through the link. Elias didn't look up from the wound. He was weaving a synthetic mesh into her torn primary artery, his fingers stained silver. Truth is, I was just trying to stop the leak. We can argue about the paperwork later. The Void Reavers didn't wait for the debate. The lead marauder, a hulking mass of scarred armor and scavenged tech, raised a plasma scythe to end them both. But Vora's hand, suddenly fueled by the frantic adrenaline of a human heart, shot out. She didn't use a weapon. She used the link, a pulse of pure kinetic energy, amplified by the bridge Elias had built, shattered the Reaver's visor and sent him sprawling into the vacuum. The guards finally broke their trance, falling into a defensive perimeter around the pair, their shields interlocked. They weren't protecting a medic anymore. They were protecting a piece of the throne. The battle for Aseris was won in the grueling hours that followed, but the real shift happened in the quiet of the recovery ward. The translucent moon turned toward the sun, bathing the infirmary in a pale amber light. Vora sat upright, the surgical bond scars on her collarbone still humming with a faint, residual warmth. Elias sat on the edge of the cot, his kit finely closed, his eyes underlined by the deep purple of exhaustion. He looked at the high-ranking officials gathered at the door, generals and priests, who didn't know whether to kneel or execute him. A bridge between worlds, forged in the heat of battle, he muttered, repeating the phrase the human ambassadors had been chasing for decades. He just hadn't expected the bridge to be his own nervous system. Vora reached out, her long, elegant fingers brushing the back of his hand. The touch sent a familiar, rhythmic pulse through his chest. The link was closed, but the resonance remained. She looked at her people, then back at the man who had refused to let her vanish into the dark. "Welcome to married life. Hope you're ready for the real test," she said, a faint, sharp glimmer of a smile touching her lips. Elias let out a long, shaky breath, leaning his forehead against the cool metal of the bed frame. In fact, he realized, the Void Reavers were the easy part. Dealing with a galaxy that now saw him as a sacred anomaly was going to be the truly dangerous work. But as her hand tightened on his, he knew he wasn't going anywhere.